All right, let's take a look at a map here and see what we're talking about geographically as it relates to Saul and Barnabas. Um, Here you can see on the lower dot there is Antioch, and then up and to the left is Tarsus. Remember, Saul is in Tarsus. Now, don't forget that he had been down in Jerusalem, and the church in Jerusalem, because of the enemies of the gospel seeking Saul's life, told him he had to leave, and they took him to Caesarea, and from there he sailed to Tarsus. He has probably been in Tarsus for somewhere between 7 and 10 years. I mean, it sounds incredible. And we don't have time to go into all of the calculations for that. You can read up on that in commentaries and so forth. But let's be conservative and say it's just been 7 years. Okay, it's been a long time. What's Saul of Tarsus been doing for these last 7 years or so? Well, most likely he has been evangelizing and even starting churches. And I think that actually will become clear when we get to chapter 15 and look at the Jerusalem Council. And I'll explain more about that when we get there. But Paul's not sitting around doing nothing. He's definitely been involved in sharing the gospel. So this is going to become a new reunion for Barnabas and Saul. They haven't seen each other since Barnabas introduced him to the church in Jerusalem back in chapter 9. Now, I just pulled up this little map giving you a little bit of a sense of the distance between these two locations. If you were to drive it, it would be about 143 miles. And so it's a bit of a journey. Is it possible that Barnabas went down to the coast there and took a ship over? It is. So, we don't know exactly how he did it, but he went over and he found Saul and he brought him back. And so what happens? He brings him back to Antioch. And so it was that for a whole year, they assembled with the church and taught a great many people. Notice again, this is the third time that Luke mentions how many people there are. When these guys from Cyprus and Cyrene first go and found the church, a multitude comes to Christ. After Barnabas comes up from Jerusalem and sees what's happening and joins ranks with them, again, Luke says many people turn to the Lord. And now here, there's quite a multitude that they're teaching. Now, Luke isn't always really specific about time. And I've mentioned that to you before. But here he mentions that they're a whole year assembled with the church. So when he is specific about time, you can pretty much mark it down. That's pretty important because he doesn't do that very often. But it really impresses him, and he wants the readers to be impressed with the fact that this church became well grounded over a period of a year. Just imagine an entire year with guys like Barnabas and Saul teaching, meeting with people daily, and just constantly, training them in the gospel and preparing them for ministry and all of that. And it's actually during this period of a year that Christians became, that the believers became known as Christians in Antioch. And you're probably aware that the word Christian was not intended to be a compliment. It was actually a derogatory term created by the enemies of the gospel in Antioch. Remember, Antioch is a Hellenistic city. It's a very modern, secular, cutting-edge Greco-Roman city. And so, these people would do anything but admire these new folks that are coming to Jesus Christ. And the word Christians literally means little Christs, imitators of Jesus, that sort of thing. As you know, later on, that title would become a title of respectability in many cases. But at the beginning, it was considered to be more of a slam on them than anything else. Well, at that time, God allows something else to come into the picture to impact the ministry of the gospel. Prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, the New Testament doesn't say a lot specifically about the nature of prophetic work. These are not prophets in the Old Testament sense. These are prophets in the church. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20 tells us that the church was built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone. That's Ephesians 2:20. So these prophets are New Testament prophets. Um, they are not writers of Scripture, as is often the case in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, many of the prophets actually were writers of Scripture, but not in the New Testament. And most of their prophecies here seem to be more local prophecies than they are prophetic, excuse me, prophetic utterances regarding end time events and things like that, as you see in the Old Testament. So, and you'll see here a case of that. What is the prophecy that takes place here? Well, one of these guys, whose name is Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout the Roman world. When he says all the world, he remembered that normally was an expression used of the Roman world or whatever empire happened to be in control. And this famine took place during the days of Claudius Caesar, who reigned from 41 to 54. So this is not a prophecy about the second coming or the millennium or something like that. Okay, it's a localized prophecy. It appears that the main function of these prophets was to accompany the revelation of New Testament truth with certain things that would aid in the expansion of the gospel as it was moving forward. Okay, so we're not talking scripture here so much as we are talking prophecies that pertain to events happening in local time and space. And by the way, Claudius Caesar is going to become a very important person in the book of Acts, and we'll talk more about him later on. He was really one of the most unlikely emperors in terms of the expectation he would do anything significant, and yet he turned out to be one of the better ones. So what happens here? How does God use this prophecy of the oncoming famine? Well, the disciples in Antioch, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. Okay? So this famine is going to really put a pinch on the poor saints in Judea. Antioch is a much more affluent city, a lot richer as a city than most of Jerusalem and Judea would be. And so, yes, they would suffer from the famine, but not nearly as much. And so they got together and they said, let's take up an offering and let's send it down to help those saints. Now remember, Barnabas already has experience with doing this type of thing by selling possessions and offering them to the people there. And so he's certainly able to give some orientation as to how this can function. And later on, the Apostle Paul himself is going to take up an offering for the needy saints in Judea during his second and third missionary journeys. So both Barnabas and Paul are going to be instrumental in helping to meet the needs of saints. Now, why is this important? What effect is this going to have? Well, in addition to the economic contribution, this is also going to bond these two churches together. Remember that Antioch was not founded by the church in Jerusalem. It was founded by unnamed people from Cyprus and Cyrene. Remember that the Jerusalem church will become involved by sending Barnabas, but it was not founded by the church in Jerusalem. So there's really not a connect between these two very important churches early in history. And so God is going to use a famine in order to facilitate the mutuality of these two churches, cooperation, fellowship, bonding. And remember that the church in Jerusalem is largely a Jewish church, and the church in Antioch is largely a Gentile church. And so the bonding of these two groups is going to be very significant in facilitating this transition from Jewish superiority to equality among Jews and Gentiles in the Church of Jesus Christ. Just a good reminder that God uses everything, even the natural events that happen, for supernatural purposes. And so each one gives according to his ability, and they send this off by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. And notice that actually Barnabas' name comes first here, and we'll see that for a while. Later on, when we get to chapter 13, the first missionary journey, you'll see a switcheroo there, and Saul's name will start to appear first because he will kind of take the lead in this. And that's by God's design. God has shown him that he would be an apostle to the Gentiles. But now, for now, Barnabas' name comes first because he's the one that's more familiar to both the believers in Antioch and in Jerusalem. And so this is very, very significant. So you can see that things are beginning to really crank out here. The church in Jerusalem is established. They've had a year of ministry under Barnabas and Saul. And now God is going to bind these two churches together through the offerings of Gentiles to the Jews, just as Paul's going to do later on his second and third journeys. And so it's a beautiful story. God is definitely steering this ship. He is in charge. And some great things are going to happen as a result. And we'll look forward to continuing as we move on into chapter 12.